Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the virtual roundtables on Asian Law series organized by the NUS Center for Asian Legal Studies. This virtual roundtable on Asian law was started by CALS as a response to the current pandemic and serves to put Asia at the forefront of intellectual debates regarding the various issues arising from the pandemic. In fact, if you look at the letters that make up the virtual roundtables on Asian law series, they form the acronym VIRAL, which is not necessarily a bad thing in this context. This is the fourth webinar of the series, and the topic this morning is entitled COVID-19 and Data Privacy in Asia, Finding the Balance Between Public Health and Data Protection. I'm your moderator, Professor Daniel Seng, and I'm the director of the Center for Technology, Robotics, AI, and the Law, or TRAIL. TRAIL is privileged today to be co-hosting this seminar with the NUS Center for Asian Legal Studies, who is represented here by Professor Jacqueline Neo, Director of CALS, in partnership with the National Chiao University Law School. Let's begin with some introduction. As you all know, some background is necessary. COVID-19, as you're probably aware, is caused by a virus that's essentially transmitted by way of droplet and contact transmission. And it has a very significant mortality rate of around 4.4%. Notwithstanding what the pundits may say, the long-term effects of this infection have yet to be fully studied. We also know it is highly infectious, and there is a long incubation period associated with this particular viral infection. Currently, no cure or vaccine is available, and treatment options are severely limited, as a result of which public health measures are extremely critical in managing the spread of this disease. As you all know, we are promoting social distancing and working from home. In fact, this webinar is a very direct result of the implementation of these public health measures. In addition to measures such as the protection of healthcare and essential workers, we also need effective investigation and testing of cases, the isolation, monitoring, and quarantine of suspects, and mass testing and contact tracing as additional public health measures we can introduce to contain this spread. So contact tracing has become an essential public health tool for controlling the spread of this particularly infectious disease. This involves the identification of new cases to break the chains of transmissions. And as our speakers will be discussing later, there are three main steps in contact tracing: contact identification, contact listing, and contact follow-up. This necessarily involves the collection of personal information about individuals. For instance, their temperatures, their health, their movements, and their activities. The frequency of such collection information can also be ad hoc or regular or persistent. The collection information could be through devices or through records or transactions, and they could be done either directly by public agencies or through intermediaries or even through private companies. Participation can be voluntary or involuntary, and there are attendant issues associated with the storage, communication, and subsequent uses of all this information, which can be collected in a centralized or decentralized way, ranging from issues such as the protection from the possible harmful disclosure or re-identification of this information to issues of security, confidentiality, expiry, and destruction of the information. Today, we are very privileged to have four very distinguished speakers address us on these various issues. A quick introduction is in order for all the four speakers. Professor Chang is an associate professor of the School of Computing at NUS, and he's the lead principal investigator for the National Cybersecurity R&D Laboratory. He is also the deputy director of TRAIL, and he has an extensive research agenda in the areas of cybersecurity, including privacy, preserving computation. Hannah is an associate professor with the Division of Business Law, Nanyang Business School, and is a double degree holder in computer science and the law, one of those very rare species. She's the author of many scholarly books and texts on law and technology, and has provided expert legal advice to NCTU and UNIDROIT. Thomas, representing the jurisdiction of Taiwan, is a professor and director of the Institute of Technology Law, National Chiao University. He researches and publishes extensively in the area of legal issues of innovative technologies in healthcare, particularly in relation to digital health, telemedicine, and medical insurance, and has participated in many projects commissioned by the Ministry of Health and Welfare, Taiwan. And last but not least, Won Bok is currently a professor of law with the EWHA Law School in Korea. And very interestingly, he is also a former physician who also holds appointments with the Department of Pharmaceutical Industry. So as a doctor, he's very eminently qualified to tell us more about the issues on hand, and his current research focuses on patent law, privacy law, and health product regulation. The themes surrounding today's presentation will essentially be threefold. We want to look at the laws and technologies that are put in place to collect personal information about individuals for healthcare purposes. We want to see whether there are any concerns about such collections and uses of personal information, and want to see whether there is a better way to balance the needs of public health and personal data protection. So without much further ado, can I invite Ee-Chien to start us off? Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Ee-Chien, and today I'm talking about more on the technical aspect of contact tracing. So we know that contact tracing is important and it's difficult. And most people carry mobile phones. So let's talk about why not we leverage on this so as to gather and collating accurate locations of individual location trace. I believe everyone in the room will say that, no, stop, please wait, hold the horse. There is a privacy issue. So now, is it possible to achieve the above and yet preserve privacy? To some extent, is yes. Okay, so now let's talk about what are the privacy information that we are going to protect and who are the nosy people. There are two types of data, location data. One is a geolocation, GPS locations or landmark. The problem is that there's another type is a proximity. That means the time where two entities came close to each other. Okay. So this is about relative locations. And this can be done based on Bluetooth signal send and signal strength and can be very accurate. That means that a mobile device will keep on broadcasting its presence and try to seek for other mobile device, and they will exchange their name card. Okay. So this is very accurate. It can be accurate up to 1 to 2 meters. And let's focus on proximity information. Suppose we have no privacy protections, this could be one way to how to make use of this data. So individual will have their walking around with the mobile phone, will continuously broadcast their presence and exchange name card with the person he get into contact. And this data will be stored locally, in the phone. Confirmed cases will then must submit their data. Okay, after they gather the name cards, they must submit the data to the authority. Authority will check and look at the names and then notify those at risk. So there's a lot of privacy issue here. For example, a nosy user could infer activities of others. So he can notice that a particular person, he had met this person twice over the 3 days and so on. In the extreme scenario, and organizations could install many sensors at various landmarks across the city. And then from that, he can correlate and know the details traces, historical traces of an individuals. And the authority know the traces of all the confirmed cases. So how could we use cryptography or mechanism to protect that? Okay, there is a very simple idea, is that instead of using your real names, the phones will use a pseudo identity. And this pseudo identity will be regularly refreshed. And there are two approaches of how to gather and manage this identity. One is a centralized versions. One example is Singapore Trace Together. Australia also follow a similar method. In the centralized versions, every user was registered with a server. The server will keep a secret key, and the server will distribute the pseudo identity to the user. Okay. So now, same as previously, the phone will gather the data and kept locally in their phone. Confirmed cases have to send this data to the server. And because server knows the master key, he will know who is in the proximity of the confirmed case and notify those at risk. You can imagine that in this case, the authority will tell the public that it's okay, you keep your own data. I'm not going to take your data. But when a person gets infected, that person must submit his or her data to me, to the authority. And because I have a master key, I will decrypt and check whether you are at risk. Okay. From an individual point of view, because he is using pseudonym every time, okay, so other individual, even collectively or organization, they are unable to infer the trace, okay, this individual trace. Another version is a decentralized versions. The Apple and Google have a system on that, and their open source system is a DP3T. Over here, the pseudo identity is generated by the individual itself. Okay, they generate the identity, they keep to themselves. Likewise, they walk around and try to exchange name card, but using their pseudonyms. A confirmed case, he will publish some credential so that from that credential is able to reveal all his or her pseudo identity, but only for time later than the time of the infections. Okay, so he's get infected, he voluntarily publish some informations. That information allow others to reconstruct his identity, his or her identity, but only at the time later than the infections. The rest will then download this information and follow the same procedure. They are able to know that whether they are at risk. Okay. So from the individual point of view, okay, if he's infected, he will only reveal his key after that times, right? And all the names are pseudo identity, so other were not able to correlate to figure out what is his trace. So do not jump to conclusion that, oh, this one is the best compared to this decentralized and the centralized version. Decentralized preserve the privacy better. It may not be the case. In the decentralized version, we still need some authority, right? We need an authority to certify that an entity is infected. Okay. Also, in the centralized version, the authority keep all the data. Everything is in one place. In this decentralized versions, the information, the confirmed case, for the confirmed case, his key is revealed. So in some sense, it's still, in some scenario, it's still possible for a large group of people to reconstruct the trace of the confirmed case. Centralized version also allow the authority to infer some useful informations, like identifying some hotspot or super spreader. This, it will be very difficult in the decentralized versions. There are also other risks involved in the tracing apps. As we know, a lot of vulnerability is not in the design, okay, but in the implementation of the apps. Open source could help to some extent, okay, to mitigate this threat. For example, Trace Together is open sourced. Although I've been focused on the proximity data, large amount of geolocation data have been collected. For example, in Singapore, there's a safe entry where whenever you go to a place, then you have to register with safe entry that I visited this place. So of course, then there is a lot of management and governance of this data. Okay, with that, I end my very short presentations on the technical aspect of whether we can achieve some privacy preserving, okay, while able to carry out some contact tracing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ee-Chien. Our next speaker is Hannah.
I just want to start off by thanking my colleagues at NUS for inviting me to speak on this very topical topic at this point in time. Without further ado, like a good lawyer, I need to start off with disclaimers and disclosures. All views expressed herein are mine and mine alone, and I have to point out that I actually do wear 3 different hats: as a computer scientist, as a law professor, and as a data privacy advocate. And for those of you who do not believe, after listening to me today, that I'm a data privacy advocate, they can have a look at my book, all 375 pages of it, where I actually criticize quite a fair bit of the level of legislation at that point in time. This book was published in 2007, including a whole chapter devoted to the collection of identification numbers in Singapore. And shortly after that book was published, they then brought out, the PDPC then brought out some guidelines on the collection of the NRIC numbers. And lastly, I'm Australian, so I'm on very neutral territory. So I don't really want to get flames about this, that, or the other online. Okay, I realize we have a lot of participants from overseas as well. So some background on Singapore's position. In terms of the policy, the rapid contact tracing is regarded as crucial because it is well known that early treatment and isolation will prevent clusters, and early detection is especially important for the elderly, for those with low immunity. And in terms of contact tracing, it is particularly important for the patients with dementia, for example, because they may not remember where they were even yesterday, let alone 14 days ago. And in Singapore, the policy is that the technology aids traditional contact tracing. It is not a replacement for it, because there is a human over the loop, which I'll talk about a bit later on. The law in Singapore is actually governed by the PDPA, the Personal Data Protection Act of 2012, but there are draft amendments already on the table, and they might be passed perhaps later this year. But the important point to note is that the government is not subjected to the PDPA, but they are subjected to similar principles, but those principles are not officially published. I mean, we have some very old guidelines that dates back to, I think, even before I came to Singapore. But certainly what the government is bound by, none of us in the public have actually seen. In Singapore, the technologies are largely led by the government. I'm not aware of any private initiatives at this point in time, apart from the government partnering with private firms to develop technologies. The whole point of using technology is to avoid being a lockdown or in a circuit breaker mode, as we call them here in Singapore. And I think one thing I really need to highlight is that we actually have 2 systems, as Ee-Chien has mentioned. One is the safe entry, the other one is Trace Together, which I will refer to as TT. Basically, they're not the same as each other. And I think maybe some citizens and residents in Singapore may mix up the 2 and think that they are replacements of each other. They are not. The safe entry system is simply to check in and out of buildings and venues and shops and so on. And it will not be able to tell if you have been in contact with a COVID-19 positive person, which is why you see the government giving out details every day of, okay, these are all the places that were visited by a COVID-19 positive person on such and such a date and such a date. You may be in a supermarket, but you don't know if you actually were in the same area or the same zone as them to be possibly infected by them. And as Ee-Chien has pointed out, Safe Entry actually does collect a lot of personally identifier information, which means actually for data privacy, Safe Entry is a far greater evil than Trace Together. Trace Together, TT actually has two versions, a smartphone app as well as a token version. The government has told us that they are the same in terms of functionality, and some seniors without smartphones were given free tokens from June onwards, and I think they will continue to be giving them out once the tender process has been finalized and the devices are made. Now for Trace Together, it is not compulsory in Singapore to download this app. And as at June, it has a very low uptake rate of only 25%. And in my humble opinion, it's way too low for it to be truly effective. And this is really the theory of network effects, which I will just explain very briefly. It's something that's been around for many, many decades. It's like, if 10 of us in the whole of Singapore has a telephone, like a landline, it's not going to be a very useful network because you can only call 9 other people. And this is the whole idea with Trace Together, because if we have our senior citizens walking around in the supermarket and nobody else is carrying these devices or have the devices, the apps on their devices, then they won't know. The seniors will not know that they have been in contact with a COVID-19 positive patient or not. The app version has been updated numerous times. And it's based on the Blue Trace protocol, and implementation of it is called the Open Trace. And Open Trace code is open source, and this means that it can be examined by anyone and everybody. And this is supposed to lead to transparency and trust in the technology, but we still only have 25% of uptake. Other countries like Australia and Canada have used parts of this source code in their apps. And in fact, I think the Canadian Alberta one is just called AB Trace Together. I'm just going to talk about the current version because I've only have 12 minutes. It has no GPS, it's got no location tracking, it's got no Wi-Fi. And I have had a very quick look at the source code. That's wearing my computer science hat. It does use Bluetooth, which actually does have some vulnerabilities because the Bluetooth low energy version does have vulnerabilities. But I'm really and truly what Ee-Chien has said, there's really no other alternative that is better. So we may have to live with those vulnerabilities. The data collected is deleted after 25 days on the token and 21 days on the app. And the data is stored locally in an encrypted form and only uploaded when the user is tested positive for COVID-19. And basically it's the government who will mandate this uploading if you have the app. Now, this is the interesting bit when it comes to the data privacy aspects, because you are not actually giving away when the phone pings your phone number even, okay? There is a unique ID number assigned to each phone or each person, but the mobile numbers are not revealed. So what happens is that the software, it generates a permanent ID along with temporary IDs that are changed every 15 minutes. So this actually does protect privacy because every 15 minutes you look like a different person to somebody else. So there's actually no way to connect devices and track a single person at all. And really what happens is that when you're actually near somebody with a phone, then the temporary IDs, when they detect each other, they will actually ping each other. And so basically it's based on Bluetooth signal strength from the other devices. So it will actually also collect other information that's related to the Bluetooth signal strength. So for example, the RSSI signals, And because each model of the phone is different in its signal strength, the app actually also collects data about your phone model. There is actually a human in the loop, which means that that it's not automatically uploaded. And from what I can gather from the source code, it is also able to be fine-tuned. So at the moment, I think the guidelines are that, it's about 2 meters. But from what I can see, it actually collects all the information within range. I'm not quite sure exactly, because the second version of the update, I have not been able to have a close look at it. So that basically it might be 2 meters, but then they can fine tune it to 1 meter, or they can fine tune it to 3 meters. Okay, now the weaknesses of the current version, and this is the current version that asks for the red color. It asks for identification number of the user. So it's unclear how this data is actually used, because all we have in terms of the FAQ from the TT is that it is stored in a secure server, never accessed, and only needed for contact tracing, and never shared with others. So we're not actually told when it will be uploaded, for example, or when it is uploaded, or whether it's always uploaded, and how they are actually doing that. And as I've mentioned before, there are BLE vulnerabilities. And one other thing which I find that is slightly problematic is that it uses symmetric cryptography and not asymmetric cryptography. But there are a lot of computational power issues if you use asymmetric cryptography. But as I've written about this research back in early 2000, that asymmetric cryptography is actually the most secure. And I think the final current weakness may be the over-reliance of the use of Google's Firebase cloud services, because it just seems to be all based on the Google's Firebase. And that could be one single point of severe weakness, because if anything should go wrong, then it's all in the hands of the Google's Firebase. Now, as for the difference between Trace Together, the app, and the token, when the token was announced, there was a petition against the token that garnered over 40,000 signatures, possibly even more by now. And when I read the petition, it was actually very confused, and it actually contained inaccurate descriptions. And in fact, apps on smartphones such as Facebook and Pokemon and Maps, they are often installed with a lot more permissions enabled. So a lot of apps that I think many of us have on our smartphones are actually collecting a lot more geolocation data and other kinds of data, like all our contacts and so on, which is why I actually refuse to download a lot of apps on my phone. And really, if you look at the use of a mobile phone as it is, it will contain signals of which mobile phone tower you are at. So they will roughly know whether you're in the Bukit Timah area in US, or whether you're in Jurong near NTU. But with a token, it's actually decoupled from the mobile phone, and it's a standalone, so it's not possible to track you or to steal data from your other apps on your phone or any other information on your phone. And the government has mandated that the cost is to be below $20, and just includes the development costs that is absorbed by the developers. And it's supposed to be, it's supposed to be able to run for 9 to 12 months with only one small removable coin batteries, like those tiny little things that you see on, remote controls. So it's not possible, and they do not, the current versions that they've shown us, or shown some of us, do not have a GPS tracker or Wi-Fi radio or any other kinds of sensors. The other specs is that it's supposed to be lightweight, and being lightweight, you can't really add on any other sensors such as accelerometer or pressure, any other sensors you can think of. And instead of forming a two-way connection of pinging another mobile device via Bluetooth, the devices now simply just broadcast the temporary IDs. And the interval for the broadcast is really a lot longer, so there is less scanning of the people around you. The token's firmware code, we are told, will not be revealed for security reasons. And I think this is a trade-off on the fact that it's small, lightweight, and the fact that it uses symmetric cryptography, because if you actually reveal the firmware code, then you can kiss goodbye the whole cryptography system. Well, as for solutions, well, I think the first thing is we have to try and discover people's concerns about their resistance to using Trace Together, because like I said, only 25% in Singapore have downloaded it. I've currently got a study at a hospital to find out what are people's concerns and needs, so that maybe we can help to address their concerns, and then to move forward and to maybe get out of this phase 1 and phase 2. The other possible solution might be ethics education, and I have suggested this in an academic paper, which I don't have time to go into. And I think what would really also help is if the government actually has an independent, detailed data privacy impact assessment. That would actually, I think, present a very full view, like the Canadian, the Alberta one. They already have published a data privacy impact assessment as of July. And I think overall, probably better communication and education is needed to stress that it's contact tracing and not tracking. And with that, I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Hannah. May I now have the privilege of inviting Thomas to share with us the experiences of Taiwan, which has been very successful in managing the pandemic.
Thank you, Daniel. Good morning, everyone. I appreciate Center for Asian Legal Studies and the Chiao and National University of Singapore for arranging this roundtable. Thank you for having me. Taiwan is comparatively successful during this COVID-19 crisis. For now, we have only 451 confirmed cases and only 7 deaths. So during this crisis, the government needs people's cooperation. So although Taiwan took a public lead initiative to collect data, but it is not a top-down surveillance like China. Rather, it's more like a public-private partnership approach. So almost all technology developed during this period of time are open sources. So the government have a website and provide all open sources information. So this allowed a private programmer to participate in developing this technology and allow the government technology to be examined by private sectors. So transparency and public trust are the major key for Taiwan's success during this crisis. The most important measure Taiwan took is the integration of health database and immigration database for border control and to check traveler with COVID-19 symptoms. Taiwan's national health insurance system is a single payer system run by the government. So with the patient health insurance card, hospitals, clinics, and pharmacies can access one single cloud called Pharma Cloud System to access citizens' health insurance data. By integrating travel history from the National Immigration Agency with the Pharma Cloud System, it helps doctors to determine if patients with respiratory symptoms should be tested for the coronavirus. So this measure, although reveal patient travel history, is considered necessary to protect, particularly protect medical personnel from infection or having to go into quarantine, and to make COVID-19 tests on patients in a timely manner. And it only discloses patient travel history, nothing more. So during this crisis, people's national health insurance cards are used like a digital identification cards for purchase surgical masks. So the government know who purchased how many masks and at which area. Whether the card should be used for purpose more than healthcare is a controversial issue, and whether Taiwan plan to issue personal identification, digital identification card in the future. So this is now is a controversial issue. But from the experience, it seems that it's essential and it's efficient. And because Taiwan has very few infected cases, so almost all schools are still have on-site teaching during the crisis. So as a result, the government asks schools to collect student travel history periodically to know which individuals need attention, and we recall which student sit at what seats. So that is for backward review in case anyone found infected. So this creates some complaint by most people's policy major, because we hope school could keep it running and open. The second important technology is called electronic fence. Unlike some countries, Taiwan did not use any app to check people in quarantine. Taiwan planned to develop some kind of app like a Trace Together, but the government never put it in public. Instead, the government works with telecom carriers to check people's location using their cell phone signals. So if individuals in quarantine leave certain location or do not answer the phone calls by local officers, the systems will alert police and local officers to begin to search for the individuals. The government first complete a list of people who are in quarantine, and the list then is reviewed by local health and civil departments to ensure the individual can be contacted at the phone number and address. And these phone numbers are then sent to one of Taiwan's 5 telecom companies. But because cell phones were constantly exchange data with nearby cell towers, so telecom systems can decide the location of a cell phone by the strength and the signals and the direction to the cell towers. So this technology does not need any app. So it reduces the risk of privacy invasion by app providers. But because this technology is less precise than GPS, so at the beginning, it often triggers a false warning. But later, the developers fix this problem. The controversy of this technology is that usually the government should get court warrant to search people's telecommunication. And as I explained later, Taiwan amended the Communicable Disease Control Act due to the SARS experience. The law will allow the government to make a quarantine order without court writ, and the Constitutional Court supports this law. So, and because this technology is the least invasive way to enforce quarantine order, it's considered legal under the Taiwan's Personal Data Protection Act. The third technology is sending warning text message to people who stay with infected people for more than 15 minutes. In April, a military ship was confirmed to have clusters infection. This is the largest cluster infection during the crisis. So before discovered, those sailors have visited for more than 90 locations around the Taiwan island. So the government needs to encourage people who visit this location to monitor their own health. Again, the government did not use any app to make it. The government asked telecom companies to find out the cell towers in the 90 locations and sent warning text message to cell phones which have contact with cell phone tower during the period of time. And because there was a long weekend in April, the government also sent warning message to people who visit some major attraction during the weekend by a public warning self-broadcast service. So only people in this area would receive the message, and people just receive message only, nothing more. For people who violate the quarantine or isolation orders, government has authority by special law to disclose the individual's personal data. The purpose of the disclosure is not to punish the individual, but it's to prevent the spread of the virus. The Congress passes a special law in February with a sunset provision to terminate the effect of law at the end of this year. For people who should in quarantine but disappeared, some local government decided to reveal the names or even other information. The central government later announced a guideline for revealing people's personal data. So revealing personal data should be the finest way, and the data should be revealed as minimum as possible. For example, there was a confirmed case in my city. The government said that the person lived beside a convenience store, but refused to disclose which the store is exactly. The reason behind this principle is that if the government reveals too much personal information, it might create negative stigma image and discourage infected people from access health treatment, therefore will spread the virus. Since March, there have been some criticism on information privacy concern. Because Taiwan does not have a centralized personal data protection authority, the government was slow and did not have strong argument or principle to respond to this criticism. In April, I remember I made a testimony in a hearing of the Congress. I said that many countries have already promulgated information privacy guidelines for fighting COVID-19. So Taiwan should have our own quickly. In May, the government promulgated a guideline to protect personal data collection. The guidelines say that those data cannot be used for any purposes other than outbreak investigations and must be deleted after 28 days. So this collection may be informed in writing or electronically, and institutions may use QR code for informal detailed information to data subjects. The major concern is whether the guideline will be well enforced because there are too many institutions. In conclusion, although Taiwan's government might be able to do better, I think the measures during this period of time are generally necessary and proportionate. In the pandemic, time is everything. Wise laws might slow down government's action or even make certain measures ineffective. But I also need to remind several things. First, both the administration and the Congress are controlled by the same political party after the election in January. So the function of check and balance is not strong between the two branches of the government. The good side is that the government needs people's cooperation to fight the virus. So actually, transparency played an essential role to build up people's trust during this period of time. But my major concern is that the relationship between the government and the retail companies. Because the system to be built up, if the future government use it in a negative way, it might be a threat to democracy. So I think the principle for this relationship should be well defined in detail and be written in law in the future. And there should be a special tribunal to make a fast decision for this kind of massive private invasive measures. This concludes my presentation. Thank you for listening. This is a picture of my university. Welcome to visit my school in the future. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Next, I'll invite Won Bok to come online and share with us his experiences from South Korea. Won Bok, the floor is yours.
Hello, good morning, everybody. Good to be on this panel. First of all, thanks to the organizers of this webinar, they put in a lot of efforts to make this operation go smooth, and it's paying off this morning. The experiences have been really pleasant to prepare and to be on this panel this morning. I'm going to talk about, I'm actually going to switch gears from the previous panelist and talk about something different. The previous panelist talked mostly about privacy preserving techniques in the process of contact tracing. But what I'm going to discuss will put any amount of privacy preserving techniques to shame because it deals with disclosing the travel history of COVID-19 confirmed patients. So as this headline suggests, it says, coronavirus privacy, are South Korea's alerts too revealing? I'll let each one of you be the judge of that, whether a disclosure of travel logs made in Korea are too revealing or not. So what does it look like? So much has been talked about these travel logs in Korea. So this is what it looks like. I pulled this from the City of Seoul's website. So it basically looks like this. It's too bad there was no English version of this, so I'll just quickly walk you through it. So here's the patient number. This is the national patient number blah, blah, blah. And this is patient number 1410 in Seoul. And the source of infection was still being investigated. This person was tested positive on July the 11th, just 5 days ago or 6 days ago. 5, and he or she lives in this district, and the person is being isolated at this particular hospital. And for the period between the 4th of July and the 11th of July, you can basically see where this person has traveled to and what means of transportation the person used. So on the 6th of July, the person dropped by a restaurant. At this restaurant, between this time period between 11:46 and 12:26, met two people. Two people came in contact. They've since been quarantined at home. The restaurant has been sterilized since. And on this day, 8th of July, the person used subway number 2 to go to work at this time, and again used the subway to come back home at this time, so on and so forth. So it is pretty detailed. And the level of information is very granular, as you can tell. And these data are pulled from credit card information, closed circuit TV, cell phone data, mass transit payments, so on and so forth. So the purpose of this disclosure is not really hard to imagine. It's in order to facilitate contact tracing. Contact tracers can do only so much in terms of finding the people that came into contact with a COVID-19 patient. So basically the government is harnessing ordinary citizens' self-help. So they are harnessing the ordinary citizens' effort to figure out if they came in contact with a COVID-19 patient. This next slide, it shows much more detailed, much more extensive travel log information. This is a different patient. Also confirmed positive on the same day, 11th of July. This person obviously has moved around more extensively between July 4th and July 11th, so there's much more information available on the website. So do you think this is too revealing? Possibly, yes. So the information, the travel logs are not only made publicly available, they are in a sense almost force-fed to the public. This is a cell phone emergency messages that you can receive from the Korean government through your mobile devices. So this is different from an ordinary text message that Thomas talked about that the government of Taiwan utilized before. So this is emergency message. This is you have to opt out to avoid receiving these messages. I had to opt out because I was being bombarded with these emergency messages so frequently. I had to opt out. but the default is these emergency messages elaborating the movements or travel history of a COVID patient that when near where you are will be broadcasted to you if you happen to have been near that COVID-19 patient through emergency texts. And the travel log data are not only publicly disclosed, but they are packaged and made available through open API. So whoever capable enough to develop a website or a geolocation map using that data can and have done so. This is a map by a citizen web developer showing the central part of Seoul. So these dots represent the places that COVID-19 patients have been to. So this is about where my school is. I live around here. So from just the looks of this map, it looks like, the citizens of Seoul live in a minefield because there are so many dots or places where COVID-19 patients have been to. A little bit of legal background here. So this disclosure of travel log was mandated under Article 34-2 of the Infectious Disease Control and Prevention Act. This piece of legislation was introduced after the 2015 MERS outbreak. I'm sure many of you are aware of it. The government in Korea was criticized for holding back data about the hospitals where MERS patients were being treated. In response, South Korea revised laws to grant greater access to personal information of infected people. So under the authority of Article 34-2 of this Act, the Minister of Health and Welfare may disclose the travel history, transportations used, healthcare facilities visited, and contacts made by patients with a communicable disease such as COVID-19. The patient can file requests for correction if any wrong information was posted. And there have been recent amendments to this particular clause to allow the chief of the Korean CDC to fine-tune the scope of disclosure according to the status and characteristics of the disease. Needless to say, this was in response to some criticism that the government was simply disclosing too much information. Now, some have questioned whether this elaborate, detailed, extensive disclosure of travel logs has helped Korea stem the pandemic. Well, that I guess is the million-dollar question. So if we think about the benefits and side effects of this travel log disclosure, well, the benefits are what I talked about a few slides ago. So people who think they've crossed paths with confirmed carriers can get voluntarily tested. And a lot of people got tested and some actually later tested positive. So without this travel log disclosure, these folks would not have realized that they came into contact with COVID-19 patients. So there's some benefit to this. And this benefit actually was possible because coronavirus testing is readily available. It's free, and it can be done really easily throughout the country. Without the readily available COVID-19 testing, I don't think the disclosure of travel logs would have benefited as much. But there are obvious side effects to the disclosure. One is it causes detriment to businesses because people know where COVID-19 patients have been to, and those businesses will be shunned by the general public. More pertinent to today's topic, there are obvious privacy concerns. Intimate details are made public, and it may, ironically, result in adverse effect on people's willingness to get tested. I'm going to talk more about this in a couple of slides later, but if you know that your travel history will be publicly disclosed. If you get tested positive, it will have a chilling effect on you to get the coronavirus testing. So a case in point, this was a Washington Post article. 2 people got tested and they both turned out to be positive for COVID-19, but they were not married couples. So people put 2 and 2 together and decided that they were having an affair. Another case in point, a virus transmission took place at a club that is, I guess, patronized by the gay community largely. And although the patrons of the club knew that a COVID-19 patient visited the club on such and such a day, many of them were reluctant to get tested because they were afraid of being outed through the public disclosure of their past presence at this club. So this is a side effect that this public disclosure of travel logs obviously has in terms of privacy. Now, one cannot but wonder if these privacy concerns are necessary side effects, because when you think about it, you don't have to put serial numbers on individual patients at all. You can just put the locations on the map and the date where any confirmed patients was at that place, and leave no tag to the individual patient, and you can still achieve the same goal, right? This is another website that collects all the geolocation data of confirmed patients. This was created by college students. This website does not give you any patient number, but when you click on these dots, you can see where this is and on what day the patient was at this particular location, but it's hard to really link the geolocation data to any individual patient. So the privacy concerns would be alleviated if the government were to make public the travel logs without any individual patient numbers. So that naturally leads us to think if what the government is doing is actually deterrence, a deterrent mechanism cloaked in the disclosure of travel logs. What I'm saying is that it works like this. In the essence, what the disclosure of the travel history does is that in Korea, if you become infected, you better have kept social distancing and you better have worn masks, because your every little movement history will be disclosed. And if you did not keep proper social distancing, or if you did not wear mask on that particular day, it will be made obvious through the travel law. So I have strong suspicion, although the government does not frame this travel log mechanism as a deterrent mechanism, I have a strong suspicion that it is an implicit intention of the Korean government as well. And it's not an accidental byproduct that this deterrence has. So in that sense, I guess this disclosure of travel history of confirmed cases may be characterized even as a nudge. Are the Korean people receptive to this whole idea? According to a February survey, 78.9% of the respondents said the benefits of the disclosure far outweigh the side effects. But as time goes on, fatigue may set in and people change their views. But this is the most recent survey I have, and the response was overwhelmingly receptive towards the disclosure. And this is my final slide. So this is also the tentative thesis from my work in progress on this topic. Well, I guess data privacy perhaps does not have uniform weight across different societies, and we may be witnessing a value judgment on data privacy by the Korean society. So what do I mean by that? The Korean society may have decided that individual privacy may be accorded a little less weight under the current circumstances. Well, the disclosure of travel history may be a compromise that the Korean society has decided to take. So the Korean society, in my view, has accorded data privacy a little less weight vis-a-vis both public health needs and individual needs as well, individual freedom as well. What do I mean by that? While many of you may view this disclosure mechanism as intrusive on privacy, well, it is not as heavy-handed as lockdown or complete shelter-in-order. And to the extent this disclosure mechanism keeps people wearing masks and keeping good social distancing, it may be a better mechanism to stem the spread of COVID-19 than more heavy-handed approach such as lockdown or shelter-in-order. So in that sense, the Koreans may have made the decision and weighed the pros and cons of both fundamental rights, and they may have decided that they can sacrifice their data privacy a little to gain more in their freedom to move around and to carry out their ordinary life as before. Well, that does not mean other society should place the same weight on data privacy under the current circumstances. Other societies may have different weight on data privacy, even in this fight against a pandemic. And under different circumstances, I think even the Korean society will put different value on data privacy. For example, if this was a lesser threatening epidemic, they may value their data privacy more. So that brings my talk to the end, and I thank you for your attendance.
Thank you very much, Won Bok. Now the floor's open to questions from the participants. So we have several questions that are in the Q&A panel already. And I think maybe we can start with a general question regarding the attitude of the general public regarding these measures from a social science perspective. Maybe a bit of insight, again, a segue also from Won Bok's very interesting survey done regarding the perspective of the Korean public regarding contact tracing. So any thoughts about what these insights may be for Singapore and for Taiwan? Both Yee-Fen and Thomas may care to comment on this particular question.
Thanks, Daniel. Yeah, I saw the question that was posed in the Q&A. I just want to, because there was actually a two-pronged question from Mr. Ho. Basically, the study is a social science perspective study, and it was actually a small amount that was funded by the NTU Institute of Science and Technology for Humanity, acronym NIST. And I am partnering with healthcare epidemiologists, as well as we are getting input from NCID in terms of the public perspectives. The study only just started because, as you can appreciate, our hospitals in Singapore have been very busy looking after COVID-19 patients. At this point in time, we don't have a lot of meaningful data because we have actually found that most people who were actually interviewed were willing to use Trace Together, TT, but there were other issues of why they were not using it. And I think this may go back to the fact that we actually have a very large population of elderly who may or may not even have a smartphone. And yeah, and so I think, I mean, as I said, the study is in its early stages at the moment, and we really don't have conclusive information yet. But I will say that the study is meant to be a cross-sectional study and a longitudinal study. So it's supposed to capture a broad cross-section of participants who from the young to the middle-aged to the old. So hopefully, and you know, in terms of the educational background as well, because we hope to capture a good cross-section that perhaps we can find some more funding to proceed with a larger study, because at the moment this is more for, it's really for infectious disease control that we are doing this at a hospital, because as you can appreciate, during this time, it would actually be the most vulnerable patients who are needing to continuously visit hospitals for checkups and so on and so forth. Thanks, Daniel.
Thomas, any thoughts, especially regarding a particular question for you in which the participant explained that from his personal perspective, the reason could be the awareness and voluntary obedience of government institutions with respect to the attitudes and how this has actually helped with the general approach towards contact tracing in Taiwan, which, if you ask me, seems more a little bit less voluntary than that in Singapore, if you think about it, especially with cell phone tracking and other forms of monitoring.
Yes, thanks, Daniel. Yeah, indeed, Taiwan take a very unique approach that we don't install any app on people's cell phone. So by installing cell phone means that the government need to get people's consent. On the other hand, if the government just contact with telecom companies, then it's a mandatory. Then every people do not have an option to opt in or opt out. Generally, the public actually supports this measure. The reason is that Taiwan has a very bad experience during the SARS crisis in 2003. So when the government announced that this kind of crisis would maybe more difficult, more serious than SARS, actually, there's people worried for their life, and they want to know who actually people want to know more. They want to give up some privacy in order to exchange for security. And a very important part is that Taiwan take a very transparent approach. And so the government make press conference every day. So every day the leader will show up and answer questions to media. So for any private concern, the government can respond quickly. And also it's an efficient way to combat fake news. So this, I would say that the daily press conference would be the most efficient, the most important measure that to enhance people's voluntary obedience.
Has there been any indication as to how helpful this information has been in relation to tracking down cases and suspect cases for isolation and quarantine purposes? The reason why I ask this question is there is an issue of cost effectiveness, of course, and there's also this additional issue of having too many false positives. So from my personal experience, I turned on Trace Together when I walked to NUS from my home, and along the way, just a simple stretch, I encountered 5 people, but according to the phone, I had 55 hits, and that led me to think, why would there so many hits? Could it be that the technology is such that it is picking up a lot more context than I visually can see, or is something not quite correct with the scope of this dragnet that is being created through the use of the Bluetooth protocol? So maybe all the panelists can try to address this question that I have that I've been trying to resolve, maybe starting with Ee-Chien. What do you think about the use of Bluetooth as a protocol for tracking contact tracing?
Yes, as I said that I think the government developed a contact tracing app, but they never put it in public. I think it's basically on the same concern that if people, maybe false alert might trigger a panic, and also from one perspective, because the Taiwan case is not many, so basically Taiwan, the Taiwanese government, they basically they don't want to reveal too much information about infected people. And so this, I think this is a reason that we never adopt this kind of Bluetooth based contact tracing app into the public.
Regarding you saw 5 person and then you get 55 hit. I think one possibility is that they are the same person. So as I mentioned before, the pseudo identity is keep refreshing. So your ads may not aware that they are the same person, which is what intended to be. So you're not able to track the same person. Okay. So that's one thing. And about Bluetooth, Bluetooth has some vulnerability, and many of them is related to the authenticity and confidentiality. That means that someone can able to see the information transmit or able to fake something. Okay, so this is about authenticity and confidentiality of the data transmitted. In this case of contact tracing, after all, the phone is broadcasting his pseudo identity. Then the issue may be less important here. I mean about the Bluetooth vulnerability. So after all, you are going to broadcast it anyway. So there's no issue of you need to secure the channel of the communications. Yeah.
I'd like to hear from
Yes.
Won Bok regarding the approach that's taken in South Korea. Have you considered using Bluetooth for tracking? And obviously you all chose not to do so. Is there any reason why this is the case?
Well, I think the whole piece of legislation that I introduced on one of my slides was in reaction to the 2015 MERS. So the criticism that fell on the Korean government was really harsh, and the pendulum totally swung the other way, and Korea came up with, I guess, most extensive mechanism to collect data from their citizens, and I don't think there's I don't think there's any turning back. I mean, the arsenal that the government has under their disposal is so powerful. They have all the GPS data, cell phone data, credit card use, mass transit payments, so on and so forth. So there's not much discussion of Bluetooth. Well, there's some discussion amongst the scientists, but from a policy perspective, I don't think Korea will go back.
Which leads us on to maybe say Hannah's insights, because there are a number of questions that have been asked regarding your take on whether you think that the approach that is taken in Singapore is one that is more invasive or less invasive, and your thoughts about whether there is this issue of legitimacy in the approach that's taken in Singapore.
Okay, thanks, Daniel. Basically, in terms of my own personal view, I actually think that it satisfies most of the data privacy principles that have been around since the 1980s. Because, for example, it does satisfy the data minimization principle, that it is actually collecting the minimal amount of data possible. It's not even collecting your phone, like, I mean, it's not pinging to the other phone your phone number. But having said that, I think, you know, for the second version of the app, it does ask us for our NRIC, which I think has the aim of having multiple people use the one phone, because there will be families with maybe only one person has a phone. And that's fine and good, but I just think that there needs to be greater clarity and transparency in terms of how it's used, and you know, and so forth. And I also noticed that there was a question on the Q&A about why not, you know, GPS. Well, that's exactly why the Singapore system does not use GPS, because GPS is really a geolocation service, although it's not precise, because I think the current GPS on our phone is only accurate to about 10 meters, or even less. I mean, also, or even more. Sorry. And so, and it doesn't work indoors anyway. So it's actually quite hopeless if you're at Jurong Point, and Jurong Point actually has JP1 and JP2. It's massive. And once you're inside, you don't know whether you're actually near someone or not. So actually the Bluetooth technology is probably the best we can come to. Which comes back to another point about the tokens, because the Bluetooth technology can actually be implemented quite relatively cost effectively. Whereas compared with other kinds of devices that you want people to carry around, they may be heavier and more expensive. And I think I just also want to clarify something that somebody asked online. What I meant about the cryptography, asymmetric versus symmetric, is actually referring to the token, because obviously the tokens must be able to interoperate with the apps. And if the tokens are set at $20 because the $20 each because the government is paying for it, there has to be limits on its specifications. And really, both the token and the app is really at its bare minimum as it is in trying to contact trace. Thanks.
Perhaps then the thought that one should consider is we are talking about all these features, facilities in relation to public health. And I think the thing that uniquely distinguishes Asian jurisdictions from many of our counterparts on the other part of the world is that we have a very strong and able contact tracers, and we're able to effectively conduct contact tracing whenever we have suspect cases or whenever we have cases whom we suspect have come into contact with confirmed people who are confirmed to have infections. And this kind of perspective, unfortunately, these services, these facilities are not easily available in the other parts of the world. Could this be one of the reasons that drive our jurisdictions, our societies to adopt this kind of approach? Although having said that, I would like to note also that all three jurisdictions have at different levels of lockdowns of their economies. Obviously, Singapore's economy has suffered tremendously as a result of the lockdown. We just saw the GDP growth figures, or I should say negative growth figures, emanating from the first and second quarters of this year. Do you think this has anything to do with the fact that in the larger sense, the PDPC excluded the Singapore government from the ambit of its operation? And I was particularly struck by the observation of Hannah that in Canada, they actually did a DPIA impact assessment on the apps which are being used, which we haven't done in Singapore. So what are the mechanisms for a neutral third-party review of these measures that are taken in South Korea and in Taiwan regarding the privacy impacts of these measures? Has there been any kind of objective study or review that's made of this process? So, Thomas, any thoughts? And then maybe Won Bok.
Yes, thank you for asking. I do think that privacy impact assessment is a critical issue for Taiwan, particularly actually, and our government actually did not do such assessment before they put those measures into practice. I think this is a difficult choice that because every additional requirement may slow down government response. And Taiwan was lucky that we act first, and so we begin from border control, and it's quite successful to prevent further infection. I often use an example that I remember in February, the United Kingdom promulgated a special law which had a length of more than 300 pages. But on the other hand, Taiwan's special law had only more than 3 pages. Yeah, so this is but we can see that the situation in the United Kingdom is very different with that in Taiwan. So I think, some measure is for is to prevent invasion in advance. But for this kind of crisis, we might need to set up some sunset provision. Sometimes we need to take action first, but later we need to review it and decide whether to continue or determine it. So I think this mechanism would be more important. And so I think the sunset provision and also maybe transparency, as I said, that the government frequently have a press conference and answer question directly and have quick response is more efficient than Congress check and balance power. And the third one is that for some certain measure that highly invasive, I do think that we should have some sort of special tribunal to approve this kind of measure before its adoption. But we need to carefully decide the condition and should make a more do not. I need to emphasize again that time is essential for compact this kind of crisis. Thank you.
Won Bok, your thoughts?
Yeah, going back to the question of formal assessment, the contact tracing or the disclosure of travel logs have on privacy. If there was one, I'm not aware of any. Maybe there was one that I've not been privy to, but that's not to say that the government pays no attention to the privacy concerns that that contact tracing and public disclosure of travel logs have brought about. The Congress has amended the law, as I explained during my talk, and the Korean CDC, which is like the conductor of the whole pandemic prevention engine in Korea. They constantly update their field manual with respect to the public disclosure of travel logs. So they've revised the manual twice already. So the government is obviously cognizant of the impact that contact tracing and the disclosure of travel logs have on the citizens' privacy.
So what about Ee-Chien? What do you think we can do better by way of the technological implementation? For instance, there have been some debate about whether or not the protocol that's designed by Google and Apple really work effectively as a way to manage both the privacy of the users of mobile devices as well as the ability on the part of the users of these devices to continue to use these devices without drawing too much power from the batteries. Any thoughts about how this could be improved, which may partially explain why the take-up rate is so low in Singapore?
So the Google version, Google and Apple version, the distributed version, as opposed to the trace together, is a centralized version. So just now I briefly mentioned what is the difference. For both of them, the data actually stay with the user. In the centralized version, for confirmed cases, only the authority knew about it. He had the key to reconstruct. In the centralized version, somehow in some type of information of the confirmed cases will be made public. So in a certain sense, is that the centralized version will protect the privacy of the confirmed cases slightly better than the decentralized version. But the centralized version have an issue because if there's no trust, one may wonder, would the authority put a lot of sensor around the world, across the city? So although they say that they claim that they are not, the data stay with you, I'm not going to take your data, but by putting their own sensor, they did gather the data. So now whether could we be more transparent about this, or whether we can somehow have some feeling that this is not been done. And also the trace apps actually, I do not know whether anyone think of that. It gives other people some additional services. For example, if I'm a shop owner, I can use that to count how many people visit my shop. and then I have a big supermarket chain. I can put a lot of different sensors around here. So whether is there a need, to have some regulation or whatever to say that there must be a person then can have carry this sensor rather than a fake, rather than stationary, just a device. Where that means that it must be carried by a person in person. So this could, in some sense, maybe avoid this type of issue. Okay, and of course, I think the take-out rate is so low is because there's no training, people not aware of what's happening, In fact, I would admit that when I heard of this app, my first intention, my reaction is not to install it. Okay, only after a while, after a few weeks, and then I started to read out the technical detail. So I have more confidence on that, but that is only after a few weeks, right? Okay. Yeah. I think that the training, the communication is the key points. Yeah.
Right. Given the fact that these applications are sometimes self-updating, you do not know whether or not it's possible for these to be enhanced with new features. Say, for instance, how many times I visited particular websites, for as an example. Right. Well, we have come to the end of this webinar, but I would like to thank all the panelists for their most wonderfully insightful and thoughtful contributions to the discussions.